dear. Sorry.
And you've heard that. But this was aimed at the country. When Keir said, we're the party of sound money, we're the party of home ownership, he was saying Thatcherites are safe to come home to the Labour Party. He was actually saying he's defined a radical centre, and there's lots of things about engaging with the 21st century.
So you're saying Thatcherites could actually come home to the Labour Party?
Sorry, comrades, can we try that again? We actually tried to show a video. I'm sorry. It's really good, actually. So we're going to try that again, shall we? From that part.
Try again.
Okay, let me try. Sorry, comrades. There you go.
Things for the membership, and you've heard that from Andrew just now. But this was aimed at the country. When Keir said, we're the party of sound money, we're the party of home ownership, he was saying Thatcherites are safe to come home to the Labour Party. He was actually saying he's defining a centre, a radical centre, and there's lots of things about engaging with the 21st century.
So you're saying Thatcherites could actually come home to the Labour Party?
I don't think anybody who's a Thatcherite can believe in Liz Truss or Kwasi Kwarteng's economic policy. What Keir had to say to the country was, you're safe with a Labour government. We've uprooted anti-Semitism, biggest standing ovation of the afternoon. We've changed our party. We're occupying the centre ground, and it spreads quite a long way now. And I think Andrew again was right about that. The centre is large.
Hello from Redline TV, and yeah, it's all done now. We can all go home. It's all finished. There's nothing to fight for because we're all right, and that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. We're going to be looking at perhaps some of the questions people should be asking. You don't expect it to get on the mainstream media. That's what we're for. And to just start with the response of Momentum, where they said, one thing is clear, socialist policies are now in the mainstream of the party, which seems to be going the opposite way to what we just heard, which was that Thatcherism is now the mainstream of the party. But, you know, delegates, we know, passed motions for a £15 per hour minimum wage, public ownership of rail and mail, proportional representation, and an end to NHS privatisation. The Labour leadership's announcement of rail and nationalisation, and a new Green Deal, new green energy deal in particular, were really welcome. But of course, as we know, the devil is in the detail. You know, apart from the fact that who on the left would actually have the stupidity to trust a word that Starmer says, what we also know is his style is to do what I call icing the cake without the cake actually being there at all. So we're going to have a look at the rhetoric. We're told by people that Starmer is in fact responding to this pressure from the left. And it's now time that the left swings behind him, because after all, we're that magical, mythical 20 points ahead. Now, others have actually said a pot noodle could be 20 points ahead of the Tory party at the moment, particularly with the debacle we've seen today on the reversal of the 45p rate of tax. Let's have a look at who has lined up, especially first of all with this version of events, because it's Owen Jones, Andrew Fisher and Paul Mason were the first proponents of this. Interestingly, apart from any other criticisms there might be about them, all three of them were people who said, when Starmer first became leader, that the job of the left was to give Starmer a chance. So instead of the left being ready to fight and defend themselves, no, they were saying, don't do that. Be ready to give him a chance. And it seems to be that actually they've shifted nowhere in this last 2 years, when we've seen the most incredible persecution and silencing of the left. So is this a brave new day for the left? Well, my version of the conference was somewhat different. It seemed to me that there was a huge amount of rhetoric around what was supposed to be policy decisions. So it was going to be a brave new day. You know, Labour was going forward and not backwards. Then we had all the jingoism, the flag waving, God save our gracious king. We were even told when they were announcing policies that, thank goodness, what we were going to be doing was making sure that, quote, the Chinese Communist Party that had a stake in our nuclear industry would actually be countered by this thing called the Great British Energy Company. And of course, where they've got that from is the Great British Bake Off, which is, I suppose, where I get my analogy with the icing on the cake. And if that wasn't enough for us, he had to add that bit about it's also because, you know, we've got to fight against Putin being in control of our energy. So any rhetoric that he could use was used. And then we were told that Labour is now the political wing of the British people, and people in the conference, or some people in the conference, you know, were ecstatic. It's very exciting, except some people seem to have forgotten that there is a history to the obscenity of twisting that phrase, because in fact it was coined by Tony Blair himself. And it seems to me that there was a keenness for many people who remain in the Labour Party on the left to be seduced by this. And also, if you like, for the Socialist Campaign Group to breathe out and feel that this justifies their extraordinary tactic of silence. It's very strange. The only thing I've heard from the Socialist Campaign Group in the last few days in terms of fighting talk has been their defence of other MPs like Apsana Begum and Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be defended, they should be, but where is the defence for the voice and the heart and the party of the left in the left? Where is the defence of members of free speech? Because it's as much a historic error to line up behind Starmer and pin our hopes to a Labour government as it was, as far as I can see, to have voted for Starmer to be a Labour leader in the first place. And that so many people are so keen to repeat that mistake in such an unreserved manner seems to be pretty astonishing, because along with some of those, shall we say, apparently positive policies, were some pretty shocking policies on immigration, on housing, on foreign policy, and an increasingly authoritarian party culture. It seems to me that Starmer represents a continuity Blair, or perhaps even worse, because I think Blair had much more talent than Starmer has. What we saw in the conference was a declining number of delegates and the erosion, further erosion of Labour Party democracy and free speech, because, you know, what we saw was one of the few delegates who was allowed to speak in any way against Starmerism. It was the delegate who spoke about what was happening in Ukraine to workers' rights, was immediately expelled. Now just think about that. It's extraordinary. He's at a conference and he is immediately expelled for expressing a view that is actually outside of what Starmer feels is actually acceptable in terms of NATO and foreign policy. Now the left are excluded from power. You know, it doesn't matter, I'm sorry. Whatever is said, they are effectively excluded from power. We saw that in terms of what happened to Naomi Wimborne Idrissi, who didn't even get a chance to go to the first meeting of the NEC. And we see that again and again in all the policies. And for those who think that that is all a reasonable price to pay because Starmer is a shoo-in, let's remember that actually the election is still a long way away. There won't be, I don't think, an election in the near future. The Tories would be mad to actually call an election. And how much politics can change. Let's remember the shift between, for example, 2017 and 2019. And even if the Labour Party won, which seems on the cards at the moment, what would that lead us to? Now remember, when Blair came in, he came into office in a what they call a credit-driven boom, you know, and at the height of this kind of US-led globalization. What Starmer would be facing is a very different world, a world that is under strain with recession, with the threat of war against a nuclear power, with the growing perils of climate change and all that means to food supply and prices. And it seems to me that what will be on offer with Starmer is a pale shadow of Blairism, and that actually what we would need to pull us out of this would be properly radical policies. Because what will be the response of Starmer's government to the struggles of trade unionists to maintain standards, to maintain the NHS, to education and other services? And of course, what conflict would there be between the unions and Starmer? Would be extraordinary. And that is something that nobody is really talking about, because, of course, the Labour Party, as it stands now, is not backing the union struggle for a better standard of living. In terms of foreign policy, like I say, we see the obscenity of the delegate being expelled for his giving his views on NATO. In terms of PR, proportional representation, what we saw was that 140 motions from CLPs supporting the Labour, Labour to back PR. So this was supported by affiliated unions. And immediately, Starmer's contempt for democracy was made plain. Now, anybody who was singing the praises of that should have been looking on the BBC website at the same time, where Starmer made it clear he would totally ignore it. He would happily ignore it, he said. Because if you think about it, if Starmer's faction have tried so hard to silence the left within the Labour Party, why would he back proportional representation, which might well let and allow in some left representation nationally? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. So do we actually expect Starmer to exclude the left from the party and not to exclude it from the country? So what do you think, Graham, Mike, Tina? What do you think? What was your vision? Shall we start first with Graham? What was your opinion of what happened during conference?
Well, Jackie, I think there's a contrast really between the resilient left and trade union voice, which was still present at conference. It was expressed not only in the resolutions that you referred to, but in some of the minority votes where the left still got 40%. So there's no question that the left is still there. But on the other hand, when it comes to power in the party, the left has been locked out in a way that I think is never actually happened in my 53 years membership of the Labour Party, because I keep forgetting I've been expelled. So, I mean, I think context is everything. And the context, of course, is what's happened in the last few years with Starmer's, it's not even, we shouldn't even be talking about Starmer, it's the establishment faction which he represents. They had the fright of their lives with Jeremy, and they are determined, absolutely determined, this will never happen again. That's why they've expelled us, suspended us. That's why they've cut down on free speech. That's why they've chucked us off the NEC. And I think this is not business as usual, that this is just the swing of the pendulum. If we keep our heads down, then a couple of years' time, 3 years' time, we can come back. I don't think that's right at all. That's not a reason, of course, to leave the Labour Party. I mean, any idea of leaving the Labour Party in the absence of an alternative which is being built is nonsense. And no such alternative is in the offing in the immediate and foreseeable future. But the context, I just want to finish with this, is this, that we are heading for a Starmer government probably. Yeah, anything can happen. But I think the Tories are going to find it really, really difficult to come back in time. Certainly with Truss as leader, their only hope is getting rid of Truss. So if there is a Starmer government, think about it, it's going to come to office in a period of acute economic crisis with an emerging, I hope, continuing emerging trade union movement. And all is set for what could be a major collision within the party, within the unions and between the party and the unions. So firstly, it's not the time to quit that field. That would be nonsense. But it's also important that any sections of the left don't allow themselves to be incorporated into this project. So I think there's all the difference in the world between saying, of course, we support Labour against the Tories. I mean, there's a desperate need, feeling for unity to do that on the one hand, but of political clarity on the other. And finally, it was said when Starmer was first leader, we were told by some of our comrades in the campaign group, don't be oppositionist, to which I sort of replied saying, well, okay, let's not be oppositionist, but let's recognise we're in opposition. And what's our prime task now in this immediate period, certainly up to the election and beyond, is to be helping develop that resistance, obviously try to develop links between that resistance and the Labour Party if we can, but that is going to be the epicenter of our struggle. It's no longer for the immediate future going to be, the centre of struggle isn't going to be in the constituencies. Of course, we continue to fight there, but it's the resistance on the ground out of which we've got to build a political alternative, and it ain't going to be easy.
Right, Tina.
Yeah, I mean, what I picked up in addition to all the things that you said is that we're in a very dangerous situation politically when it comes to international matters. And that was reflected in the singing of the Ukrainian anthem, or playing it. I don't think anybody knew the words, but they were playing it. There wasn't a peep, just like there wasn't a peep when the national anthem of Great Britain, or whatever it's called, United Kingdom, was sung. And that worries me, and especially if you look at the issue of how the one single delegate who stood up against that terrible pro-war motion, and he made a speech, and I don't know if comrades have seen it, it's somewhere on YouTube. It was pretty, Angelo Sanchez, it was pretty, well, it was strong worded, and he said, a vote for this motion is a vote for war and for imperialism. Entirely right. That's exactly what it is. It was a very one-sided motion, and he was the only one who was called to speak against it. And he was suspended in the middle of conference. And again, not a peep. He was booed. Actually, at the beginning, there was sort of, a bit of applause and stuff, and then he was booed by delegates, etc., which I think is extremely worrying when the opposition, the socialist, opposition, is so keen on war. That is extremely troubling. How far this sort of pro-war chauvinism has spread in the party, and it does remind me of you don't have to be don't have to go back too far, 1914, well, it's over 100 years, so it's quite far, but that's when the working class across the globe was torn apart and sided with its national chauvinist leaderships in the need to, support your country, support your own country, and go and, kill your brothers and sisters, your comrades in other countries. When a few years before, there were big conferences, international conferences of the left across the globe, where they, said we must stand firm. Everybody knew this was coming. World War I was not a surprise. Everybody knew it was coming. And Rosa Luxemburg and the Russian Bolsheviks, etc., and a few others stood firm, but the rest of the socialist movement fell behind their leadership, and I fear that the whole atmosphere in that room was pretty similar to that, and I find that extremely worrying, considering that we're in a situation where another world war is entirely possible, and it's presented as this is just Putin's fault, and he's mad, he's a madman. It reminds me of Adolf Hitler was just a madman, etc., and we all have to go to war, etc. It's far more complicated than that, far more complicated. Most of these things are. And the German Kaiser was a madman that everybody has to oppose, etc. There's lots of other things at stake, and we haven't seen the beginning of it yet, I fear. So national chauvinism is something that troubles me greatly.
Yeah, and I have to say, as somebody of colour, I'm sorry, but I found the whole flag waving national anthem terrifying, and I just find it extraordinary that somehow, as an ethnic group, my trauma is not recognised within the Labour Party. The trauma that people like me feel from the colonies is not recognised within the party that supposedly more black people vote for than any other.
But also, very quickly, I think that whole issue of the war was being presented as, it's got nothing to do with NATO, or it's got nothing to do with imperialism going down the drain, and there are some serious problems. Imperialism has serious problems, and this whole war drive against Ukraine and against Russia, the whole war drive against Russia and China in a more longer term is an attempt to stop the decline of international imperialism. It won't work, of course, but it is a way to, expand, etc., to increase weapons production, to, get your economy going, etc. But it is worrying that much of the left doesn't see it that way and seems to fall behind the government.
I think much of the left, I'm sorry, and I'm sure we'll come on to this. Much of the left actually wasn't in the conference. The number of delegates was small. We know that huge parts of the conference centre were actually curtained off. Delegates had been suspended and expelled just before conference, and there was no doubt that people knew what would happen to them if they spoke out. So I do think we have to make that plain, that was the atmosphere of conference. What about you, Mike?
Yeah, I'll touch on that, Jackie, because I think that's one of the key lessons of conference. Listen, Starmer's not claimed fresh political ground here. That he's not a single trench has been occupied with conviction, despite what everyone is now saying. Really what's happened to distinguish him, where he was indistinguishable, where he was a tabula rasa before, is that Truss and Kwarteng have moved so far to the right and have lapsed into one of their, as the Tories do from time to time, periodic lapses into zealotry and navel-gazing, that even a leadership as compromised as Starmer's was able to gratefully accept whatever grounds they left behind. So in relative terms, it does look as if there's been significant increments of progress, but in fact that's not the case. I mean, I think we can claim, I don't think it's unreasonable for parts of the left to claim small increments of policy advances. That's fine, because I think it'd be foolish not to note those and to register them and to fight to consolidate, but also, of course, to extend them far beyond where Starmer is keen to go. What I think makes socialists like us concerned is the credulity of certain parts of the left in what exactly has been gained, and the wild overstating of what has been gained, as if there has been some kind of breakthrough at conference. And listen, I don't want to be too hard on those people. Many of those people are my comrades up here, and I'm not here to condemn people as renegades, but it's so disappointing that at a time when we have a nasty streak of authoritarianism running through our party, and it's been here for a number of years now, and Labour Files is only the latest documentary evidence of that the very authors of that authoritarianism are being extolled. Yeah. Because they have offered us some meagre crumbs from the table, and that's we gained a little, but we also lost a great deal at that conference, and some things that we have been concerned about on this programme were probably brought into very, very sharp relief. One of the things that I think we can now say to ourselves with a measure of confidence, and we know this anyway, that how a party behaves, any party behaves out of governmental office, is a useful barometer of how it's going to behave in office, if and when it achieves office. And a party that has behaved with such cruelty and indifference and callousness towards some of its oldest and established members. When he talk to Ian Drummond later on, I know Ian from all kinds of campaigns, and Ian's been one of these Labour Party members who did not check the credentials of the people that he's going to go and campaign for. He campaigned for Labour Party people irrespective of their politics, and as Ian will tell us later on, his reward for that is, well, it's no reward at all. So although I think there has been gains, what I suspect we will reflect on tonight is the motives of some elements of the left who have framed those gains as some kind of political breakthrough when it's certainly not that. And I absolutely agree with the comments. If and when we do get a Labour government, And it does look that way right now. If polling is to be believed, although the dynamics in Scotland as always are a wee bit different. I should say that the Tories are probably overtaken only by the SNP at their despair at these polls, because the key SNP strategic approach is to tell the Scottish electorate, unless you go for independence, there will be Conservative governments in perpetuity. And the only way you are going to not have a Conservative government is to go independent. Now, the SNP have got a bit of a strategic problem on their hands if the polls stay the same. But beyond that, even assuming that the Tories ditch Truss and Kwarteng, which I think is distinctly possible because they are nothing if not ruthless, I think that a Labour government is still pretty likely, and I agree with Graham and others who've spoken thus far. Our job is not to cheerlead that government and to desperately hang on to whatever increments we have managed to squeeze out them, which we know are not nearly enough. We may get sucked down a hole of just trying to hold on to the meagre things we think we've gained. Our job is to keep on building that opposition, both inside, but from my point of view, but especially outside the party, to keep building that alternative and see where that takes us.
Absolutely. And just two things struck me from that. Is that, it's fine, isn't it, for Starmer? Now he's silenced the left within the Labour Party. He's, they don't have a power base within the Labour Party, not within the parliamentary Labour Party, not within the structures of Labour. He can now, offer a few crumbs to the left, because what he wants the left is to come back as the usual voting fodder and the usual activist fodder that just kept on, supporting whatever Labour was doing. It's easy for him to do. And one point on terms of the Labour files, if you've watched number 4 of the Labour files, you'll see that this is actually an allegation, and it seems quite a well-founded allegation, that somebody who is within Labour has been hacking journalists' files, and has actually been, that has been used by the shadow justice minister. So if you have a shadow justice minister who is going to okay that within the Labour Party, what on earth are they going to do when they're in power? Yes, Tina.
What also struck me is that the official Labour left momentum, Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, Andrew Fisher and the others that you mentioned, they don't mention at all the defeats that the left suffered at this conference, which always strikes me as deeply dishonest. They're celebrating this energy thing that we're going to take a closer look at if it's actually worthwhile celebrating. But we got defeated all the way through. So Momentum CLP didn't get a single of their motions through and the subjects they wanted to discuss. CLPD had concentrated on a rule change that would have got Corbyn back in, which I think was wrong from the beginning, actually, to have a rule change just for Corbyn while not talking about the rest of the witch hunt. Defeated. The Conference Arrangements Committee will now be elected at conference in its entirety, which means we're getting rid of the 2 people, I believe, who were elected via 1 member, 1 vote previously. So that was changed. The National Constitutional Committee, those elections went to the right. Not that it's doing much. I think it's all going via the NEC at the moment, but it's supposed to be where disciplinary cases go. And there was a reference back that was lost on the national policy paper produced by the National Policy Forum, which is where policy making has been outsourced by Tony Blair, and that's still going, unfortunately, because it didn't mention Palestine. It didn't mention the position on Palestine that was agreed last year. Didn't mention it. The reference back is the only way you can challenge that kind of leaving out things. Lost. These are issues, if you were there, you notice it. I don't understand why the left does not understand the need to talk openly and honestly to its members. I know there's always this rah, rah, rah. It's almost like the SWP. You have to always make a positive point so that people don't get disappointed. But in effect, you're lying to your members if you pretend this was a shift to the left. It's extraordinary how they think they get away with it. imagine the kind of socialism these people would build. It beggars belief. I mean, it is a sort of top down, and let's just not worry the little children with the truth, but pretend everything is hunky dory. That is not the way to build a fighting working class.
Well, Tina, it sounds to me like it's time to bring Ian Drummond in,
Shouldn't we? Yes.
and let's see what he has to say.
Hi, Ian. You were one of you were trying to be a visitor to conference, didn't you? And then you got, what did you get?
Yes, a visitor this year, a delegate last year. I think it might have been my contributions as a delegate last year that got a target on my back.
What did you speak about? Remind me, that was quite a good speech last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were a couple of point of orders, and I also got to make a speech. By the time I was trying to speak about Scotland, they said I couldn't speak more than once, and then called a guy from London who'd spoken before instead to talk about Scotland because they were on to me by then. But my points of order, the first one was when Margaret Beckett, on what she called a murmur of consent, moved the National Executive Committee report that included the prescription of the first tranche of prescribed groups, which included Ken Loach, automatically excluded for supporting Labour against the witch hunt. It had already been indicated that it couldn't be referenced back, which led the hall to believe there wasn't actually going to be a vote on that item. It was just for information, and then she got it through that way. So I got up and made a point of order on that, and again in the morning after debate on the same thing, where I think I even accused her of gaslighting because somebody else wanting to continue the I think real hair of points of order and dissent that I set running at that stage.
Yeah, no, I do remember your speeches. They were quite good. They were going around.
I'm going to take a minute's silence that I hadn't mentioned before for that young woman who'd just been murdered. So if you think your point of order is more important than that, so it was really shameful, as well as shambling at times, incompetent chairing from Margaret Beckett, who I see since has indicated her intention to stand down. I wonder if I had any part in her downfall. I don't know.
So
but,
this year,
I think she may have had a part in mine.
Ian, this year you tried to become visitor.
Yeah. I went for election as delegate again in my CLP, but didn't get elected. They like to rotate, and that's fair enough. But I applied to go as a visitor. One day after I applied to go as a visitor, I was terminated. It was an ongoing thing that had been hovering over me for about maybe just under half a year since the turn of the years. And then it was in July. So yeah, about 6 months exactly, actually. It was for organising a meeting with Mark Wadsworth 3.5 years ago that was supported by Labour against the witch hunt. So they said, on the balance of probabilities, because they supported your meeting, you're probably committed the prohibited act retrospectively of supporting them. Part of my response to them, I said, this reminds me of Ronald Reagan to the Evangelical Conference. He said, I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. There was that kind of distinction, albeit the other way around, that I made. I said we should learn from that distinction rather than from his economic policies, which is what sometimes it seems that we're doing at the moment. So I do intend to put in an appeal at that. But the funny thing was, I thought, well, at least they're efficient. They got me out just as soon as I applied to go to conference again. But I was actually wrong, because 2 weeks before the conference, I got my conference pack in the post. And 1 week after that, I got an email saying, we've looked over your application to go to conference. It's all checked out. You're good to go. If you've not got your pack yet, though I did, you can pick it up at the door. Welcome to conference. We're delighted to have you. So actually, I don't think their right hand knew what their other right hand was doing because of all the money they've been losing from throwing so many of us out and the data breach and all the rest of it. Nice cat, Mike. I didn't know you were a cat person. So I thought maybe I'll put my appeal on hold and just go up to conference arrangements and ask, well, which one of these things, the termination or my my being allowed into conference is an error. I could kind of guess which one was likely to be, but I might as well travel, hopefully, I suppose. But then 2 days before conference, I got an email saying, due to changes in your membership status, your pass won't work, which I never tried out, but somebody did, and I didn't really want to say unless they're happy about me saying who that was. But I did tell a few people at conference, if I told you who that was, you probably wouldn't believe me, because it's someone they should have really spotted. And I was told back that at one point even Keir Starmer's pass did not work, and for a couple of minutes he wasn't able to get in until, I suppose, he said, do you know who I am?
A lot of confusion there with the new compliance unit.
Yes.
Left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. You also saw Naomi going in, I believe,
That's
or trying
the
to get in.
That's the one.
That's the one. Okay,
saw
so
her
she got
going
in and was bundled
Yeah,
out.
with me and a few JVL comrades saw her go in, and at that point I thought, yeah, maybe I should go back and get my conference back. After all, I've even let her in. I mean, it's disgraceful that they expelled her 2 days before conference, and it's shambolic that having done that, she then was able to get in anyway for a wee bit, and then got bundled out again just after getting onto the NEC, like a couple of days before our first meeting. So yeah, it was a strange conference. Good fringes, good beyond fringes. But in terms of the conference hall itself, I was relieved not to be on it for the national anthem, which in a way was disrespectful to the Queen. A lot of people were saying maybe it's even a bit sexist. They never sang it for her for 70 years. And as soon as she's dead, they do it for Charles. To be fair, I don't know if it's sexism, because I don't think they ever did it for any of the other kings that were on the throne in the early days of the Labour Party either. I think it's just the general move to the hard right by Starmer. And the interesting thing is that this was actually something John Landsman was really good on back in the day, that it's no point passing good policy if you've got no levers to hold the leadership to actually carry any of it out. So this constant from the last couple of years momentum saying, well, push these policies through. Well, we've got a couple of victories here and there. That's a great advance, but we keep losing on the rule changes. Seems to me very much the wrong way around, especially when you've got such a right-wing leadership. That at least in the 70s, they had to get into government to repudiate their policies, and that's sparked off the Tony Benn revolt. Last year at conference, they just went on the telly an hour after it was passed. And in terms of the Palestine policy, you might not be safe staying in the party as a member for supporting it and using the same kind of language was actually passed at conference, if I remember.
Starmer has qualified that conference is only sovereign during conference, and then you can ignore whatever it decided.
We should hold a continual session in that case, or a recall conference. But yeah, in terms of this question, finally, there was a good discussion, I think, on the Crispin show, though I missed all of it yesterday. Should the left get behind Starmer? And we're talking about that just now. My take on it is you have to fight to get the Tories out. You also have to fight to get Truss herself out if she goes before an election, because they're so weak and there's a lot of struggle, and that's looking quite likely at the moment. That will be a good thing too. That doesn't mean that we're positively behind Tricky Rishi or Penny Dreadful or whoever it is that they get in after her, but it would be a victory for us for her to be gone, and indeed for the whole Tory lot to be gone. But in terms of getting positively behind Starmer, haven't they been had already? I mean, I never actually believed them in the first place at the 10 pledges and that. The man's got form. So Laluta will continue even if he's in office, and he won't be our friend.
We have to get Starmer out as well, no doubt.
Exactly. We should be working.
Thank you very much, Ian.
We should be working to get Starmer out too. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. So, comrades, we were obviously there's so much to reflect on coming out of conference, but we only have limited time. And the key policy area that we want to focus on tonight was the environmental policies that emerged from conference, which of course have been greeted, particularly in the liberal media, with a great deal of fanfare, and amongst, as we've been discussing, some sections of the left, significant investment, and a lot's been taken from them that perhaps ought not to have been taken from them. So we're going to speak to Matthew Crichton. Matthew is a member and a leading activist in an organisation that's unique to Scotland, the Just Transition Partnership, which is an alliance, I guess, Matthew, you'd maybe call it, between the STUC, 5 trade unions and Friends of the Earth. So, Matthew, welcome. First of all, I wanted to ask you, we were kind of chatting about this earlier on, and you described yourself, I should say that Matthew's speaking in a personal capacity and not formally as a full-time officer in Friends of the Earth. But we were discussing earlier on, Matthew, that you felt that you had, through the Just Transition Partnership, one foot in the environmental movement, another in the trade union movement. Can you describe what you meant by that?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I'll just repeat that I think it's a remarkable fact that the Just Transition Partnership is an agreement to advocate for a just transition between the trade union movement, or big parts of it in Scotland, and parts of the environmental movement. And that's a really strong alliance. And it's also an alliance in which both sides of it learn a lot. And, socialists and trade unionists here will have a strong view that that environmentalists have got a lot to learn from the trade union movement. But you could say the other thing, say the same in the opposite direction as well. And it's been a very productive process in which we've sort of learned a lot about each other. But frankly, I'll just finish on this, that the positions taken by the STUC and particularly by their General Secretary, Ros Foyer, at the COP26 in Glasgow last year were, to me, truly inspiring to hear that the advocacy for a just transition so clearly put, a working class just transition so clearly put by Ros, that it really repaid all the work that's been put on around that. So that's just background. That's where I'm coming from. The key thing is I'm an activist within Friends of the Earth, and I've been an activist within Unison as well, a foot in both camps.
Thanks, Matthew. And so if we turn our attention to what actually emerged and we interrogate perhaps a little more than has been the case so far, the policies that have emerged and their actual merits. Public ownership is the key thing that's both present in Starmer's announcement of a single public energy company, but is also absent, of course, in terms of the key energy companies privatised by Thatcher during those years remain in private hands. Can you remind us why that is such a gaping hole in Labour policy, despite the fanfare? Why is it so important for a coordinated approach to dealing with the crisis that any future Labour government also take into a public ownership, the energy companies, but also, Matthew, the national grid, which I think is something that's not even been mentioned?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. I'm going to take the liberty of just framing the whole my framing of the whole stuff at the conference about climate change, not the environment as a whole, but climate change. I just want to say, before we say what's weak about it, that I am really pleased that Labour has used that framing, that there needs to be a solution to the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, and climate crisis, and that it's the same solution. And that there is a party saying that is such a fantastic relief. And to be quite frank, there are big sections of the left as well as the centre ground who wouldn't do that. I've got that. That's where we're starting from. But it's, as you say, it's good to have that messaging, but you need to have the substance behind that. And if you say that you are going to solve these crises, if you say you're going to make prices cheaper for people, if you're going to say you're going to decarbonize the energy system, you've got to be able to show how you're going to do that. And while there are some things which in what was announced, which we definitely want, to me the problem is they won't actually achieve fully the outcome that we need. And just before I just put a bit of detail on that, if you're struggling around climate change, there is an end objective that you know very, very clearly. You've got to stop global emissions. You can't stop some of them and it's all right. They've got to stop. right? It's an endpoint, and you can judge every single plan by whether you get that endpoint. And that's the strength of the just transition messaging. The transition is getting to that endpoint. The process has to be just, and it has to be effective. So just on the effectiveness stuff, certainly from my point of view, there's a big problem with both of the, in Scotland, the SNP government, but any party which says we're going to hit these targets if they don't show how they're going to do it. And there's therefore a big problem with any perspective which doesn't critique why they're not being achieved. And it's not difficult for people on this call to understand they're not going to be achieved when you leave it in the hands of the market. If you say, I'll just give you a bit of context in Scotland. You say this is a good thing, by the way. I think Scottish government says we want a just transition plan for every industrial sector. Right. So if you're going to have a plan which says how you're going to meet those targets, you've got to see the money flowing into the stuff which has to happen. And you've got to see the ways in which you require big businesses to play their part alongside the private sector. So if you're doing that, then you've got to show where in your program you're going to achieve that. Now, what we find is that over and over again, unless you can take control of that process, you will have no certainty of achieving those objectives. That's why the advocacy of public ownership is central, and it could be municipal ownership in some respects, it could be national, it could be Scottish, and that's the core part of it. And then getting to Great British Energy, if you read the words, it's additional capacity alongside the rapidly expanding private sector. That's the offer, right? Yeah. And strategic partnership with the private sector. And this is the kind of stuff which we're familiar with in Scotland as well. And what it means is, it's also like the story of those energy companies like the Bristol and Nottingham ones, which were doing a bit of stuff to make energy cheaper, municipally owned energy companies. You're competing on the same terms in a rigged energy market, which is dominated by big corporations. And I'm in favor of trying to do that, but it's not going to transform the system, is it? And quite clearly, that's why back in 2017, it was really important to say, we're going to take over the energy system. And as you say, I'll just finish on this bit because I can go on for too long. I know that. A core part of that is the national grid, the most profitable part of British capitalism, and also the absolute key in terms of opening up opportunities, but also obstructing them if the investment isn't done in the right way. So driving the transformation through public ownership, to me, public ownership of the whole system, not a public company that is permitted to compete with the big corporations, is absolutely central.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll ask you one more question, but I was reading the other day that there's been a lot of comparisons made between the 2017 and 2019 offers, which were hailed by environmental groups like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace and others as the key and most effective strategies that had ever been put on paper and offered to the British public by a socialist-led Labour Party. I was reading the other day that of the £8 billion that Starmer's committed to renewables, that's what a Corbyn-led Labour Party committed to generating additional wind power alone. So again, those kind of comparisons that they're telling, and of the just transition, I know you, we said at the outset, Matthew, that you are embedded in a class-based just transition alongside Friends of the Earth, but alongside the SGEC led by Ros Foy and a number of trade unions. What is this is a difficult question to answer, I appreciate, but what are the key demands of a just transition that you think Starmer has left out his programme? So what would you be asking and are asking for that is absent from a series of manifesto commitments, assuming that they're ever implemented? We know that Starmer has a flexible relationship with the truth. What's missing from that offer that as a just transition campaigner you would want to see in there? Yeah,
let's just be clear. I'm speaking, I'm not speaking. I'm speaking from what I've learned from that work. I'm not speaking for the Just Transition Partnership. Sure. But clearly it's not very different. First of all, like scale and ambition. one of the things I thought about this is that, like, fairer and greener sounds good, but fairer and greener actually isn't quite good enough. What we want is fair and green. That's my take on it, and that's my point about, you don't want to sort of have cut some of the emissions. You've got to stop all of them, the emissions. So like greener, no, please, let's make it properly green. So on that point, I mean, we are in a, obviously maybe in a staged process, but the policies talked about at the conference were about decarbonizing electricity, which is in a sense the easy stuff. We do know how to do it, and it's really good that the Labour Party has got obviously some very, very sensible policies about doing that. So that electricity good, but what about transport? What about heating our homes? These are the tough ones. What about food and agriculture? Not that we don't know how to do them, but I wouldn't say that it's like they're all as straightforward. So it's got to be bigger in two senses. First of all, it's got to be all of the energy, not just the electricity part of it. It's also got to be bigger in terms of the money, because as you said, £8 billion again sounds like a big money, but it's not very big compared to what we know to be the scale of the investment, whether it's 2 or 3% of GDP every year or whatever that is required. And indeed, it's not as big as the scale of the investment which was promised in the last election. So I think what I'd say, if we probably need to wind up, that there's enough here. If you're speaking for what do environmental organisations have what one might expect them to say, obviously welcome the stuff that they say they will do, but in a sense it's all to play for filling it out to say, no, well, if that's a good start, but there's a whole lot more to do in order to achieve the targets which we've signed up to. Yeah, I'll stop there. See if
Thank you.
Brilliant, Matthew. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. We might well bring you in later, but now we're going to go to Alan Simpson. Alan Simpson, of course, who was an MP for many years and also an advisor to the Jeremy Corbyn administration. I mean, what I've just heard has just really, I suppose, confirmed my suspicions about, the vacuum behind much of the rhetoric. I'm particularly concerned about the fact that this is being hailed as a solution, and we're kind of forgetting, if you like, what we were trying to do before. But before we kind of concentrate on the green issues, and that, that is very much what we want to do here, yes, because they're crucially important, but also because it shows the style in which the left, I think, is being deceived. I mean, what's your opinion, general opinion, about the conference as we saw it?
Well, I think the conference is a sideshow. And if I look at the things that the left can feel upbeat about, one is, I guess, that Truss herself is such an unpalatable person with an unpalatable political package that people are sort of veering away from her, and she will, I think, make them completely unelectable. So in that sense, there's good news. There's a political space opening for the left. Does it mean that what Labour put up on offer would get us out of the climate crisis that we're already heading into? The answer is no. Can the left feel anything good about that? My answer is yes. It opens up a space, and it's the space that Tony Benn always wanted the left to occupy, which is to be ahead of the game and redefining the game, because the game itself is untenable. And climate breakdown will drive that way beyond any platitudes that come out of the Starmer managerial team. So in essence, I think that is what the left can feel upbeat about. the reservations I have is I was just working this out. From my 18 years in Parliament, I worked out that for at least 16 of those years, I was either the secretary, chair, or vice chair of the Socialist Campaign Group. It was a bit of a movable feast, but it was always the platform upon which ideas beyond the manifesto were being pushed. And I mean, I used to get drawn in probably on a weekly basis to the whip's office, just bemoaning the fact that I was out of line yet again, and giving me various bollockings. And my defense was always, I was never out of line, never out of line. I was always just in line early for the next manifesto. And I think that's the role that the left need to occupy, because the next manifesto is going to be around not political choices, but about survival choices, because we are rapidly being overtaken by climate breakdown. And to address that, we have to embrace not piecemeal change, but systems change. And it is going to come as a real shock to the system, because lots of these little sort of flags that Labour likes to wave are going to have to be abandoned. Traditional growth-based economics is based on growth in consumption. And that is untenable, it's unsustainable. So we're going to have to move towards an economics of circularity. And if we're going to stay within manageable climate or temperature change limits, the practical consequences of that are that every aspect of our economic and political choices, and the ones that Matthew outlines relating to transport, energy, heating, eating, all of these are going to have to exist within a framework that sees carbon emissions reduced by 10% every year for at least the rest of this decade, and probably for the entirety of the decade that follows. So that is a completely different notion of economics. And there are all sorts of, it's scary, but there are all sorts of exciting ways in which people and places are trying to do elements of this, and they need to fit into a bigger picture. And my sadness about the campaign group now, the only thing I'll say introspectively there, is that I can't find them. I don't know where to find the radical left that does what Ben asked us to do, which is to think beyond the frame. I can't find that platform in Parliament and connecting with visionary movements outside.
Yeah.
Now that's the first. The second is this is going to be a big challenge for large parts of the Labour movement too. And in a sense, you could see this in the gaps in the GB energy policy. If there was one thing in it that Starmer got right, it was the commitment to insulate 18 million UK homes. Absolutely the essential thing to do. Matthew will know that if you start putting that through the just transition process, you very quickly come upon the skills gap that we just don't have the personnel to be delivering that scale of work at the moment. So we have to reach out to our colleges and to young people to give them those skills to deliver that sort of transformative change that delivers heating comfort or comfort and security without increasing consumption security. And we can do that. And the great thing about it is my granddad used to say to us is that the fantastic thing about training and employing and paying the poor to do that work is that the money go round works best when you pay the poor.
Yeah.
And all of those, the movements and meetings I used to do in the constituency, and I'd ask people, if we increased their pay by £10 a week, how many of them had offshore accounts to put the money into? No one ever did. No one ever did. And if you ask them what they did with the money, it went into the local economy, and that money go round worked in the interest of lots of other people as well. So we need to get back to the interconnectivity of that and the relocalization of our thinking about food systems, the 15-minute city. You know, in parts of German towns now, you can't get planning permission for a new estate, for new housing that is anything more than I'm not sure whether it's 200 or 300 meters from a tram stop. So you actually have that built in. Matthew raised the point about heating, and there's a fantastic town in the Netherlands called Heerlen, where they looked at their disused coal mine and decided that actually the water down in the disused galleries was so hot, permanently hot, that they just drilled down, they put closed water piping in, they pump it round, and that now provides renewable heat for the whole town. And Britain has got 25,000 disused and abandoned mines. And the British Geological Society, they estimate that 1 in 4 of UK homes is within ducting distance of heating from those disused mines. So the possibilities are vast, but there is nothing in the Starmer programme that reaches out of that. And Jack, in the last part, and this is actually, it's a scam, GB Energy, because if you look at the detail, it's almost certainly going to be a front for funding new nuclear.
Yeah, and I was actually just about to bring that up. That and another issue which Matthew was talking about, which is that it strikes me that in this drive to welcome Thatcherism, that's what was said, Thatcherism back in the party, that the N word, nationalisation, is still a dirty word. This great British energy company is actually a way of not saying nationalisation, which is actually what you need to do. And if you look at any of the figures of the nationalised energies in other countries, you would see that, according to the figures that were released by the trades union, you would receive about between 63 billion and 122 billion in terms of profits for the people were those industries nationalised. But it strikes me that Starmer will bend over backwards to avoid doing that, and that's what this policy has actually done. But I'm very interested in terms as well of how this is going to work in terms of the nuclear industry.
Right. Let me just turn this, because in some ways we have to twin track our thinking and arguments on this. One is the money go round and how much the public ownership of energy would actually pay the public back. The second is how you decarbonize the system. And you don't decarbonize the system by reinventing yesterday. And in each power station, or in the current energy system, 50% of energy is lost at the power station. In the case of nuclear, it's 70%. And if you're really serious about radically and rapidly decarbonizing the energy system, you also have to look at the much more successful examples of decentralized distributed energy systems. And they also have to be ones that don't separate out electricity from heating, and probably need to go a step beyond that and look at the use of surpluses when they're generated to cross support things like tram systems, so that you have clean transport modes being supported by the surpluses from clean energy generating modes. And you massively reduce losses by localizing the distribution and storage system. Now, this is where you would build a radically different and inclusive democratic basis for society, because it's no longer remote. It goes back to where we started from over 100 years ago, and that is that we've lost confidence, even remembrance of the fact that up until 1945, all of our energy companies were local energy companies.
Yes.
They were municipal energy companies, and the profits from those energy companies across the land paid for the construction of the libraries, the parks, the swimming baths, all of the municipal entities that we came to take for granted. And that was because they were all designed to provide both energy security and quality of life improvements for the local populations. Now, in a sense, the existence of the national grid for me was more important than the nationalization, state nationalization of any particular company. And for many years, we used to describe the national grid as the nation's strategic reserve. It was how we supported each other across local boundaries. So you had infrastructures of energy connectivities. That's what they've got today in Denmark. It's what they have today in Germany in the federalized system of energy generation, storage, and support. And we have to rediscover that for ourselves, or we have to discover that other people are doing what we've completely forgotten how to do, because it involves different forms of socialized ownership. And the role of the grid, I mean, there are even examples, better examples in the USA of socialized climate conscious grid organization. In the Eastern Seaboard, the grid operator by the states was given the responsibility of having to deliver, I think it's a 5% reduction in carbon emissions each year and a 5% reduction in total consumption. Now, the operator said, well, we can deliver a 5% reduction in carbon emissions just by buying different energy. Okay, we can buy clean energy. But a 5% reduction in consumption, we just maintain the wiring. And they said, how do we do that? And the answer was, well, you're going to have to go into partnerships with local authorities and social housing providers to invest in the upgrading of people's homes in order to deliver that reduced consumption. And until and unless you do that, you can't distribute profits and dividends. So the network operator said, oh shit, well, then we're going to have to find ways of partnering, reinvesting our profits first into reducing consumption before we can reward shareholders. There's tons of models on this, but my question, and I guess this is my last comment before you dive back into me, that it is, where is the left in generating the platform of new ideas that fit into a terribly fragile climate conscious world that has to live more lightly in our own locality and learn to share more generously on international platforms with those elsewhere who are having to do the same.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the big challenge for the left. Where do we provide the intellectual leadership that will lift the ideas so that we're in the driving seat? I don't care then whether the party would let me into conference. I don't care whether the party would let me speak. I don't care whether I could ever get elected to the NEC, or, well, they told me I'd never be allowed back into Parliament, but I don't care about any of that, because they can't stop the ideas passing through the walls. And we're the drivers of the ideas. That's the best hope we have.
So it's almost what you're suggesting is that the left builds its own forum where these questions are posed and alternative visions are given for the future. And to provide those alternative visions, we also need an ideological change. And this is what too many on the left are missing. That is not what is being offered by Starmer.
No.
Starmer is offering a continuation of exactly the same. So
absolutely, but let me just throw that in, Jackie. In a sense, that's the good news. That's good news, because whatever Starmer says, it is not a deliverable program that would get the country out of the mess that the next Labour government would inherit. So it needs something more. Now, the challenge for the left is that we ourselves have to be something way better than just a bunch of grumpy old farts, because I don't care what Paul Mason is saying, or Owen Jones, or who was the other comment, the analysis that welcomed the thing? Jeremy's
Andrew Fisher.
Andrew, yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew is a fantastic welfare economist.
Yeah.
Never understood climate at all. But so what? The left gains nothing if we simply occupy spaces that moan about the shortcomings of others. We have to fill those spaces with better ideas.
Yeah.
And that is the real big challenge. When I go out on the streets here or wherever I do meetings, it's never difficult to come across tons of people who are scared to death about the world we live in and the space we're heading into. What they're short of is ideas around which to lift their hopes and share them with others. And that's the challenge, I think, that we have to occupy. How do we get beyond the grumpy and into the inspirational?
Right.
And that's down to Graham.
Talking about yeah, exactly. Talking about the grumpy, I think we should ask Graham. What do you think of what Alan has just said? Because I find that quite inspirational, that actually here, in a way, this is the left, ignore what the Socialist Campaign Group are doing and all the rest of them. This is the space that the left needs to occupy, one that marries, if you like, the ideology of socialism with the need for climate change. And what do we do with the grumpiness, Graham?
Not being grumpy, I think that's a challenge too far, Alan. I think I'll define that as a sort of ultra-left ghetto to stop being grumpy. No, you're absolutely right, of course, but I think that in putting forward our alternatives, we have to respectfully and in a comradely way still challenge those who profess to speak on our behalf. Because I don't think we can avoid saying to my good friend Andrew and Owen and all of these, you have not only got this wrong, you've done a number of things wrong. Because I tell you why, Alan, it's not just mistakes. These are quite dangerous because, I'm looking forward. You said we've got to be the people looking forward to the next manifesto, the next kind of level of struggle. To me, and who knows, but the next fundamental challenge, collision, is going to be between a Starmer Labour government and the working class and the trade unions. And we've got to really be sure that somehow we're not giving succor to the people we're fighting against. And this is the danger of saying, well, he really is open to a coalition with the left and we can be the left voice or the left side of this coalition. Because my fear is that we're trying to build a resistance, which is the critical thing. And I don't want us to be isolated with some of our own side going over. So, okay, I'll meet you halfway, Alan. I'll stop being grumpy. You're got to stop being quite so nice and actually sometimes say to these people who have got it wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So let's meet halfway. No more. Okay. I'm not going any more than 50% along.
Okay, no, that's fine. But can I tell you what I say to them? I sort of, at the moment, I tend to listen sort of semi-respectfully to what they're saying. And my response is, so just tell me, how exactly is that going to deliver a 10% reduction in carbon emissions next year and another 10% the year after and another 10% the year after? Just talk me through the how of your ideas delivering that. And the answer is they haven't got a plan. They haven't got a clue. You know, in many ways, they're still, you know, kicking the can down the road in the same sort of way that the Tories try and do. So it's to, you know, that 10% is a 10% per annum is a really critical question that the left needs to start every bloody conversation with, because climate is in the driving seat. Climate physics isn't hanging about to know whether it's going to be let in to the conference chamber at all. It's happening, and the upheavals now are massive. We've seen those around ourselves this last year. We've seen them internationally. The scale of those challenges demand immediate responses to those who, you know, who are flooded out their homes, who are sort of pushed out through forest fires, who are pushed out by drought, who are pushed out by cold or by famine. These are just going to overwhelm the next Starmer-led government. And the left have to be saying to those who would act as cheerleaders to this, how exactly will you deliver food and energy and carbon reductions that will actually keep us from going over the cliff edge?
Mike, what would you say to, as Alan calls them, the cheerleaders on the left?
I thought, as Alan and Graham were speaking, I thought they were going to arrive at the Brian Clough formula, that we will discuss tactics, we will go back and forward, and we'll have an open conversation, and we will decide that I was right. But I would listen. We've all read Owen, we've read Andrew Fisher, we know either personally or politically people in the campaign group. These are all people who I want to dismiss, as I say, and adopt sectarian approaches to. But I think Graham is right. In a comradely way, we have to be very clear with people, particularly when, as Alan says, we're dealing with an existential crisis of the nature that we've been discussing tonight. We don't have the luxury of being anything but brave. And sometimes that means being brave with people who you've got affection and a fraternal relationship with, and saying, I'm sorry, comrade, but you know, we're at a juncture in human history where it's too important for us to get things right. And we're involved in a war of ideas, as we know, and we have to, with absolute conviction, occupy some of these trenches. And I think that tonight has maybe clarified and confirmed again just how important platforms like Redline TV are, because we need a platform where, as Alan said, and this is one of the key disappointments for me from Andrew and Owen Jones and others, as Alan said, part of our job and part of our historic responsibility is to look beyond where we are now. We don't have crystal balls and we don't have blueprints, but we are, without lapsing into hyperbole, we are socialist dreamers, and we have to dream and we have to see beyond what's available right now. And unfortunately, it seems that too many comrades have latched on to what is available right now, and for reasons, I guess, best known to them, have seen that as a victory, and a victory that needs to be consolidated rather than taken and built on and pushed much, much further than where its authors are prepared to go right now. So that is what that's, I guess, the final thing I would say is how important we are, and other platforms and other comrades and other organisations. We have to have people who are prepared still to dream and have a vision and be transgressive, be transformative in their thinking, and always be thinking steps ahead for where we might be months and, well, I say years, but we know we don't have that time ahead of us right now.
Mike, can I just say, I'm sitting here with a big smile on my face. I'm really pleased that you mentioned Brian Clough, because he used to come out and campaign for me, and and they used to let me train with the Forest squad. And one of the things that's, you know, the Clough stories that stayed with me was they had a captain and midfielder called John McGovern, who in many ways was quite an ordinary player, but he said Clough changed his life by just getting him to see the things he could do, and actually taking him to a level that was beyond where what he thought he was capable of. And he said it all came up in the trials he had. Clough pulled him out and he said to him, "Hey lad, I saw you at trials. I just want, you've got something about you, but I think I want to see what the limits are." And he said, "Get a ball and run to corner flag, go around it and come back here." So McGovern, got a ball and ran to the corner flag, went round it and came back past Clough, and he had his clock watch on him. And then Clough said, "Okay, now do the same thing again with that ball and just do that." So McGovern did that and raced back. And Clough said, "Now, did you notice the difference?" And McGovern said, "Aye, yeah, I was much faster second time round." He says, Clough said, "So the lesson, young man, is this: pass the fucking ball." And that's the same for the left and ideas about visionary change.
Yeah.
We've got to have the sense to understand the game, see what's going on, and pass the fucking ball. And that's, in a sense, where I think the big challenge is that we've got to rise to.
Yeah. Tina, what would you be saying to those people who are telling us to get behind Starmer?
Well, it's more general. I think the passing the ball is exactly the point. And there's been a couple of questions in the chat, and it's of course a big discussion now. Where is our political representation? Who's going to fight for these ideas and how? The Labour Party is, we've said, Richard Bergen, Rebecca Long Bailey, they're all hailing Starmer now and his energy thing, which is pathetic. As you point out, it is not what is needed. The Green Party is not hit either. The Green Party is within the confines of capitalism. They don't have no interest in getting rid of capitalism, which is, of course, at the heart of climate destruction and needs to be tackled in the medium term, if not the short term, because the need for profit of capitalism needs to make a profit and constantly expand. That is a huge problem. But then there's the unions. Well, they have their own difficulties with what we know is needed in terms of their own jobs, protecting their own jobs. That will lead to limits of what they can actually fight for very quickly themselves, as well as the lack of democracy in the unions. So there is a point, we need to have a strategy towards the Labour Party. Undoubtedly, there's still probably more socialists within the Labour Party than there are in the little groups outside the Labour Party who are organized, That is still a problem for us. We need to have a strategy of engaging with them, but we also need to have ways to develop a program of what is actually necessary, and that is quite important. How do we do that? I don't believe it's either the Socialist Labour Party or Resist or this or that or Workers' Party, etc., or Socialist Workers' Party. There's 100,000 varieties out there. It needs something quite radical and quite different, with a different culture and a different democratic way of looking at things, and having radical ideas and actually saying what needs to be said. And that's an ongoing discussion that none of us at the moment have the answers to, but it is long overdue, and hopefully alternative media and openly socialist media like this can develop those kind of answers. But that was a really good discussion. I enjoyed that. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to take away from this, apart from passing the ball, is our job, which is to elevate the discussion as well, is to actually imagine outside of the confines of Labour, and the confines of Labour, which are getting, it seems to me, smaller and smaller every day. And with that, I want to thank everybody for the discussion, everybody for coming here. I know some people had their hands up. Don't forget, please, next week, we're going to have your right of reply on Monday. We're going to continue with this discussion. It's an absolutely crucial discussion, because just like Alan says, it doesn't matter if they ignore this. This is going to come back and bite us all on the bum. And so with that, thank you very much. Good night. Don't forget to help us financially fill in Patreon, pay us money, and have a great week. Bye-bye, comrades.
Solidarity.